Let's talk about Ukraine and Russia. There's been a lot of talk online recently about what was the cause of all this conflict to begin with, and of course Trump made his ridiculous comments as usual that Ukraine's to blame. Well, you can put some part of blame to them, I get that, I think that's what Trump was trying to say, but Russia's the one that actually went into Ukraine in the end, so it's not actually Ukraine's invasion. The trouble is that people are having the wrong discussion. As usual, Trump says something, they talk about that, and then people have these back and forth on tweets and replying to each other and think they know what they're talking about, when in fact the Ukraine-Russia conflict itself is purely tied to Crimea. It's actually not tied to NATO expansion. It's a part of it, yes, that's true, but that's down to the way people on each side see it. So Russia, for example, so I'm not going to comment on the NATO side directly, but I'll give you their comments they made, the leaders from European countries over the years, at least some of the things they were saying. But Russia's point was this, and the video will play shortly, that Putin was talking about how if Ukraine joins NATO, and as a result of joining NATO, Ukraine decides to attack Russia. In this case, Russia will see an attack on them, even though Crimea is recognised as part of Ukraine. If they go after Crimea, you will then be a party to the conflict, which means you have to join the conflict. Because Putin's point has always been, to the European leaders in particular, well, what's the point of NATO if you're not going to join the conflict? Well, there'll be no point of the NATO being as an existence if you don't have this thing going on that says, well, if attack on one nation is attack on all. Because Crimea is now under Russia's control. And you've now got a country which has now got a part of its land taken by Russia. So that was Putin's bigger point. So here's the video now, I'll play it to you.
Я хочу еще раз все-таки подчеркнуть это. Я говорил, но мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы вы меня услышали все-таки в конце концов. И донесли это до своих читателей, зрителей и пользователей в интернете. Но вы понимаете или нет, что если Украина будет в НАТО и военным путем будет возвращать себе Крым, европейские страны автоматически будут втянуты в военный конфликт с Россией. Конечно, потенциал объединенной организации НАТО и России несопоставим. Мы понимаем. Но мы также и понимаем, что Россия одна из ведущих ядерных держав. По некоторым компонентам, по современности даже многих опережает. Победителей не будет. И вы окажетесь втянутыми в этот конфликт помимо своей воли. И вы даже не успеете глазом моргнуть, когда будете исполнять пункт 5 Римского договора. Господин президент, конечно, не хочет этого развития. И я не хочу. И я не хочу. Поэтому он здесь и находится и мучает меня уже 6 часов подряд.
As you can see in the video itself, you can see how angry Putin gets. So probably perhaps the only time you've seen Putin get angry on screen in front of journalists, saying, you guys still don't get it, do you? I've told you this many times before. This is the problem we have. They're not listening to us. Europe doesn't care. Europe keeps saying, oh, don't worry. We don't join NATO. We're not going to arm them to the teeth. We're going to join Ukraine, give all these weapons to Ukraine, so they can attack you, right? Even though we know this is simply not true as well, because if you actually listen to Petro Poroshenko himself, in this next clip, he talks about how the Ukraine was part of a quote-unquote a global anti-Putin coalition. Here it is.
These documents give Ukraine 8 years for building up army, for building up economy, and for building up global pro-Ukrainian anti-Putin coalition.
And you would tell from that video, what was the first part he was talking about? He's actually referring to the Minsk agreements. Russia signed those Minsk agreements in good faith. Regardless of whether you think they were bad actors or not makes no difference. They signed on that agreement saying, you've got to abide by these rules in Ukraine. And what did Petro Poroshenko say? We're going to spend all this time using the Minsk agreements to go after Russia, to attack them and hurt them. So to think that Russia will just made this up out of nowhere is just not true. Russia were rightly to be concerned. Not to go into Ukraine the way they did, they were rightly to be concerned about what was going on. So it comes back to this. What was the issue? Ultimately, Crimea. Putin explains this pretty well and says that, look guys, we cannot have this situation come up. And you guys can't sit there in NATO and say you're not going to do anything about this. We have concerns about that. If you go to NATO, the comments made by NATO leaders, let's say, or people from the past, in Europe, let's go back to 2005, NATO initiated an intensified dialogue with Ukraine, signaling a step towards close relations. April 2008, at the NATO Bucharest summit, while the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And if you remember, for those who can recall back then, Lavrov, who's the foreign minister of Russia, said this is a no-go for us at all. He actually warned about this back in 2008, around the time this actually was mentioned at the summit. Germany and France opposed granting them immediate member action plans, referred to as MAPs. German Chancellor Angela Merkel later defended this stance, suggesting that offering MAPs could have escalated tensions with Russia. Well, she wasn't wrong, was she? Go to 2010 in June. Under President Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine's parliament adopted a law establishing a non-aligned status, effectively halting aspirations for NATO membership. Let's fast forward to March 2014. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea, NATO reaffirmed that its door remains open to European democracies willing and able to assume the responsibilities of membership, implicitly including Ukraine. December 2014, Ukraine's parliament voted to rescind its non-aligned status, renewing its pursuit of NATO membership. June 2017, the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, I probably pronounced that wrong, passed legislation designating NATO membership as a foreign policy priority. September 2018, the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, which I mentioned earlier, submitted a bill to Parliament proposing constitutional amendments to assure on Ukraine's commitment to achieving NATO and EU membership status. And EU membership is nothing to do with NATO. That was not really a concern of Russia. So there's always, over the years, an effort by European leaders to kind of balance this, have a balanced support for Ukraine, meaning that they don't want to provoke Russia and also at the same time Ukraine join NATO. You can't have it both ways. So it came down to this: eventually Russia will do something about it. Whether people think it's justified or not makes no difference. It came down to the final point that Putin made to Macron, who was standing next to him in that press conference. You saw the video earlier, saying that you cannot seriously sit there and tell us that as you are doing all these things behind the scenes, and we thought you were actually being truthful about this, which you weren't. But regarding Crimea, a very important thing for us, that if you were to get Ukraine to join NATO, you'll be a party to this conflict. And he mentioned he went about a chance to go for Article 5, because his greater point was, we know NATO are more capable than us. We have bigger capabilities than us. You're far more bigger than us. You could defeat us. And if we think we're losing, we're going to use nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. As the saying goes, no war without Russia. So I'm not sure why people are getting drawn up to this whole thing about being picky about what happened during the Soviet Union, what happened with NATO expansion in the past. That is a part of it. But the big question was always going to be Crimea. If you don't know how Russia feel about Crimea, look at every time Ukraine attacked Crimea during this conflict for the last 2 or 3 years to see how Russia reacted. The first time Ukraine hit Kerch Bridge, or attempted to hit it, and they damaged it, right? What was Russia's response? 24 hours later, Russia took out 40 to 50% of Ukraine's power substations, right? Not when Russia being attacked directly in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg with the drones. No. Hitting Kerch Bridge caused that reaction from Russia. So if you don't think Russia and think Crimea is that important, think again. And it's a very, very big part of what's actually happening right now.